Hello and welcome to week 3 of Women in Gender Studies 1000. So this week we're going to talk about consciousness raising, and I am very curious to read the reflections for this week, just to see how familiar folks have been with this concept, where you might see it popping up in the world, things that you've seen that kind of are maybe similar to it or informed by it. What you think of the different kind of movements that we're going to talk about today, and their relationship to consciousness raising. So I'm really excited about this one for sure. So we're going to talk about the history of consciousness raising. We're going to talk about how it's used today. Okay, so what is consciousness raising? Consciousness raising is an unending process for discovering ourselves as a group and making ourselves anew, both as individuals and as a movement. So we'll explain a bit. So feminist consciousness raising stems from the idea that women were impacted by sexism, and this comes from the 1960s, that women needed to be educated about the ways in which feminism was, or that sexism was impacting them, and to embolden them with self-determination, but to also sort of raise up armies of folks who were all on the same page and were willing to fight. And there's a lot of ups and downs and political split-offs we'll talk through. But the idea is that folks are gathering together to share their personal experiences with sexism, sparking thought in another person in the group who would join with their own story. So the idea is that because these experiences are systematic, while they're not universal, there are elements of shared experience there. And so hearing other people's experiences can help you recognize your own, sharing those out can help you recognize theirs, and so on. And that leads to thinking about these experiences as communal experiences, as representations of systems rather than just individual bad actors, right? I think the idea was often that there were some dudes who were just bad. Another idea was that women were indeed just supposed to be subordinate, that was what God intended, or that's what biology intended. And these groups were hoping to empower people, and that empowerment is really important for safety. It is a lot easier to abuse someone who does not think they have a lot of self-worth. And so building up self-worth in folks is really important as well. But the way that folks frame these communal experiences was to say, our experience is that of our poorest, most brutally exploited sister. So this idea of sharing your own personal experiences leading to others, so you can better understand not just your own experiences, but also others, including folks who have marginalized identities that you do not have. And this all relates to what we've been talking about the last couple of weeks. The idea that in feminism and women and gender studies, sharing our own stories with each other helps to build each other's knowledge, and that's foundational to feminist thought and to women and gender studies as a discipline. And sociology and women and gender studies are kind of considered siblings or pieces of the same movement. And you see this in some ways in other social sciences too, but really the origins of this type of seeing value in stories comes from feminist thought, and comes from communities of color and sharing of oral tradition. Another quote here from Red Stockings, which is a publication representing a group of what we'll soon talk about as the more radical feminist leaning side of this next piece of history. And they said, we reject the idea that women consent to or are to blame for their own oppression. Women's submission is not the result of brainwashing, stupidity, or mental illness, but of continual daily pressure from men. We do not need to change ourselves, but to change men. And this piece about not the result of brainwashing, stupidity, or mental illness is certainly interesting, in that you hear these kind of two ideas, and you'll read this a lot throughout the article you have to read this week. That you have these kind of two competing ideas, one that feminism is brainwashing and that the main priority needs to be kind of waking people up, that feminism is an intentionally created product by men, and that we need men to buy into resolving that.
All right, so we're going to go ahead and watch this video from MSU, which I think is just a really great breakdown of consciousness raising, and no attempt that I could possibly make to duplicate it would be better or more thorough than what I think this is.
All right, folks, let's take a look at Catherine McKinnon's piece on consciousness raising. This text should be pretty straightforward. It's pretty clearly written and quite accessible, but I will briefly go over some of the main points in McKinnon's text. So in this text, McKinnon is arguing that consciousness raising is both a political practice as well as a feminist method or methodology that is transformative as well as perceptive. So it's about both the capability or capacity to perceive the world in a particular way, as well as transformative in the sense that the political practice and feminist method can be transformative in the lives of particular women. So consciousness raising is a political practice and a feminist method that is both transformative and perceptive, since social attitudes and material conditions are reciprocally constitutive of women's oppression. So for McKinnon, consciousness is a way of knowing. And as she argues, all revolutionary movements create their own ways of seeing the world in order to transform and change the world. So she talks a bit about the history of consciousness raising as it sort of sprang up in grassroots movements in the 60s and 70s. And consciousness raising groups sought to have a kind of intragroup equality among women, where everyone's voice was equally important. And this was the condition for identifying women's situation. And McKinnon argues that women are a group not because of some essential or biological characteristic, but because of a sense of shared reality in their treatment and experiences, which provides a basis for social identity. So in consciousness raising, women's lives are discussed as they're lived through experiences without the presence of men, which made speech possible in these consciousness raising groups. Women came to value each other as sources of insight and advice and information, thus as sources of knowledge. And this was a new source of knowledge for women, since their understanding of the situations that they found themselves in and the experiences that they experienced were previously mystified in terms of the political structures and power relations that shaped their experiences. McKinnon explains that people who don't know themselves experience a kind of paralysis of consciousness. And this paralysis of consciousness influences the production of knowledge ignorance, one's capability to know about themselves and the world. So women's self-concept emerged from consciousness raising. Women were able to interrogate themselves by asking things like, who am I? How am I treated in my family? What are my feelings about life? How do others experience me? How do I carry my body? How do I interact with others? And these are questions that prior to collective consciousness raising didn't come up for women. Women accepted their roles in the world and in their families without an awareness of their own situation. So interactions that were typically seen as insignificant, though upsetting, were discussed in these consciousness raising groups. For example, how men looked at women, how being sexually objectified makes women feel, why women hate their bodies, the ways in which men have power over women, and what women can do in these kinds of situations. So these values, social and political values that were mystified, became unmasked by talking about everyday experiences of work, interaction with others, sexuality, orgasms, lack of orgasms, sexual harassment, violence, etc. In this way, women became aware of their social conditions, their social situations, and their self-concepts, who they are in relation to the world, through a collective consciousness raising and
I just want to mention really quickly, one, that I had to change my microphone because the other one was dying. But also that this is a trend we're going to see come through as we talk about lots of different identities this semester, that pardon that people have to have language and context often in order to be able to describe their experiences. So this is one of the reasons why we see language shifting over time. And the requests of movements or of groups shifting over time, why it can feel to some that people are constantly asking for more and for more, is that as people gain access to community in this way, they can also become more aware of why they feel the way that they do and how these systems are impacting not just them, but other people like them, and therefore that it is systemic and not personal.
collective knowledge production. So qualities that we are told are natural, like heterosexuality and gender, become demystified, and the force of these structures is laid bare. And this knowledge often makes women feel unburdened, because what they previously took to be individual failures to live up to some ideal no longer appears to be an individual failure. And we saw this in Bartke's piece on psychological oppression. And much like Bartke explained in Psychological Oppression, women have found themselves to be inwardly dependent on men through internalization of gender norms and the structures of heterosexuality and the power relations in which women are submissive to men. And this internalization causes women to think that they are less of a woman without a man. And the interesting point here is not only that women conform to these structures, but that there is a kind of standard of heterosexuality as ideal, in which men benefit from the very arrangements, read the sex-gender system, heterosexuality, by which women are deprived of social, political, and economic power. And further, any challenges of women's dependence on men are seen as threats to male identity and to male self-definition. But for McKinnon, consciousness raising is the other side of powerlessness. So the feminist mantra, the personal is political, that we've seen in a couple of the other readings, came out of consciousness raising. Women's individual experiences of powerlessness, of violence, of harassment, of subordination are not only personal, but they're socially structured. They're political acts. So consciousness raising calls into question the givenness, the naturalness of social relations by understanding women's situations as they are lived. So women's experiencing how they experience themselves is the process and the product of consciousness raising. And this is the core method of knowing about the world. So it's not only a practice, it's an epistemology. It's a way of knowing the world. Consciousness raising is not a scientific method aimed at objectivity, in the sense that objectivity is a relation between some abstract, disinterested knower and some known object. And as we've seen, contemporary epistemologists, not only feminist epistemologists, but social epistemologists and other even mainstream epistemologists would reject this view that knowledge simply is a relation between an object to be known and an abstract, disinterested knower. So feminist methodology as consciousness raising is an epistemology that produces knowledge of the world through women's experience in and of the world, not despite such experience. So the position of consciousness is in the situation of that which is known. Consciousness is itself located. Knowers are themselves located. Mind and world are not separate, but interpenetrated. And so knowledge is not a copy of reality. It's not a kind of representation of the world. Although representationalist models would have it that knowledge is obtained through distance and aperspectivity, the view from nowhere. So verification becomes contextualized, and epistemology becomes the study of the life situation of consciousness, which is both political and historically contingent. So the socially situated consciousness also has to be attuned to male power, which is a social relation that is lived every day, justifying itself as natural, unchangeable, and morally correct. Male hegemony and female inferiority are self-enforcing. Again, they become internalized, and thus male hegemony is at the same time illusory and not illusory. It's mystified, but it's real. Yet consciousness raising allows women to comprehend themselves as devaluated rather than as invalid. The process by which their validity becomes devalued and devalidated becomes illuminated. So rather than seeing themselves as wrong, as invalid, as inferior, consciousness raising allows a collective knowledge production in which women can see the process by which they are made to be inferior, disvalued, invalidated. It also allows women's feelings to be appropriate responses to their conditions and situations. And understanding their situations allows women to see that there is another reality, that there can be another reality, that it's not a given natural fact about the world that women are inferior, disvalued, and invalidated. Although there is objective data about women's situation, for example, the fact that women are still paid 30-some cents less on the dollar than men, yet this kind of objective data doesn't allow women to see that this inequality, this hegemony, this dominance is not natural. It's changeable. There can be other ways of being and knowing. Only through consciousness raising can women's situation be known for what it is, and only through consciousness raising can women know that it can be otherwise. So consciousness raising illuminates the fact that although women are in subordinate roles that are not random or individual, they're not merely personal, but they're political, women can see the possibility of knowing themselves in their worlds and understanding their situations, and women can thus act differently. So women come to see themselves as shaped in the image of subordination and oppression, yet at the same time struggling against it. So feminism, through consciousness raising, tracks who a woman becomes growing up female in a male-dominated society. It reveals that male power is real, but also that it's not the only reality, although it claims to be. Male power, male knowledge, claims to be universal, natural, given. But by demystifying the processes through which male power and male knowledge set themselves up as universal, we can see the contingent social and historical situations through which women have learned that men are ideal and women are non-ideal, men are rational and women are irrational, while at the same time the sexes have been said to be equal. So consciousness raising allows women to make a world outside of the world man has created for them, but this requires both knowledge and vision.
second. Okay. Okay, so a lot of what that person is presenting in the video is this earlier piece of conscious raising that we're going to talk about, where in the ways it was originally proposed, and I would probably argue in the ways that it is for the most part commonly returned to, though not always, in that you have all these specific components. You're talking about experiences, you're having that specifically illuminate how sexism is impacting people. And let me go ahead and share my screen. And what the article that you've been given for this week talks about primarily is it gives a lot of context and history, and that's really the main reason why I'm having you read it. Their argument is essentially that over time, this became an ineffective tactic, or was used ineffectively, because that initial piece of connecting women to their own lived experience was no longer being connected to this idea of, and therefore this is a system that we can do something about. So some early reactions to conscious raising in the 60s were that it was a waste of time, that it would create further division between women, or that it was just kind of an all talk scenario. And there was a movement within feminism at the time that was primarily composed of people we would describe as second wave feminists, which we'll talk about in a bit, who saw this as not action oriented enough. The idea was that this system is essentially doomed. We need to give up on it, to exit it, to, in some cases, create our own womanist societies, in some cases to just think really big in terms of moving into direct action and activism, wanting to get as many people in power as possible, or to build our own systems of their own systems of power as women, to engage pretty rapidly in protest, to create and communicate demands pretty early on. Whereas other folks felt like before we get there, we need the women of this country to understand why we are doing that, and how quickly to move through that process and how effective that could be. And the risks and rewards of that are a lot of the questions that we explore here. But the idea, as that professor previously was talking about, is that it is intended to all be connected, and that you need this as part of building the coalition and making the change. So in the late 60s and early 70s, there was a split between many of the radical feminist organizations, those second wave folks that I just mentioned, and there's essentially disagreements within that movement. Folks split off into their own groups, which can often be the death of a movement, or the death of the popularity of a movement, just in that people are not sure where to focus their attention, or don't want to be associated with that infighting. And at the same time, the media messaging around feminism was really negative, specifically in that it was too radical. And so throughout the 60s and early 70s, a more respectable and approachable, and those are words people would use to describe it, and are certainly very words that we could talk about a lot as very gendered and racialized. But this feminism of consciousness raising, of what I think we would now kind of refer to as like girl power feminism, began to take hold in the media. So in 1970, there was a march to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the women's right to vote in the US. for white women, and sorry, I paused in the middle of a sentence. For white women, to the right to vote for all women in this case, white women in particular tended to be the folks who were seen on the streets in this celebration. And yeah, this gets really quickly messy in terms of, we talk about what's seen as respectable and approachable. That was absolutely the feminism of white women, primarily who were relatively feminine presenting, and were not having the same conversations, at least publicly, about challenging things like just should the nuclear family exist. They were talking about kind of how the dynamics within nuclear families can be really problematic, but not necessarily, as radical feminists had, kind of calling for the end of marriage, or in some extreme cases, the end of heterosexuality. And then as we move through time, as we move through the 70s, we kind of see these two groups not necessarily merging together again, but starting to use some of the same tactics and recognizing the importance of working together. And so many of the folks who had previously frowned upon the rise of consciousness raising begin to adapt and use it. And I think that really stems from, the original intention not being fully understood, the importance not being understood. I think, and then when you go off and try without it, you may realize, okay, maybe there was a point to this. And at the same time, you have the folks we would call the reformists, the folks who wanted this more publicly accessible feminism and a whitewashed feminism in many, many ways. I think there's also room for them to recognize that they maybe were not doing enough. And so we see that through the history of feminist movements as we move forward. And how do we kind of reconcile these two elements of our movement that are both important and both have a purpose? So by the fall of 1979, the now Consciousness Raising Task Force of Madison, Wisconsin had the express goal of using consciousness raising groups, quote, to bring women to the women's movement on a personal level who would not normally be involved on a political level. And so this is that the personal is political that the professor was talking about, and where you kind of see this return to consciousness raising as a source of political power versus in the early 70s, where things were certainly a bit different. And then you also start to, at the same time, see dips in conscious raising being used in radical ways again. So we have this back and forth with the more radical folks coming in, starting to recognize the importance of consciousness raising. There's some conversation about reckoning around the reformists possibly not being radical enough. But then you really kind of see, as we move into the third wave, that reformist strategy doesn't take hold maybe quite as fully as the radicals had in the time of the second wave, but certainly informs the feminisms we see in the third wave. So third wave is kind of what we refer to as like Hillary Clinton's feminism. A lot of politicians we see who are women, this kind of the feminism they come from. And it's informed by this consciousness raising that began to reach that point of striking the political through the consciousness raising, but not necessarily taking it quite as far as folks as we'll see in the fourth wave, in terms of using it in a more radical way and talking about intersections. So these are some quotes from the article you have for this week. So the evidence indicates that conscious raising is now regarded as a therapeutic milieu as opposed to therapy, both by clinicians and by most women who engage in it. So this is the idea that conscious raising became a space just for the sharing of people's experiences and not necessarily for tying to political action or to dismantling sexism. Conscious raising became mainstream, and with that became the dulling of its political angle. The socially understood and accepted feminism became focused on supporting other women and increasing self-efficacy rather than on destroying systems of oppression. So where do people stand today? So these are the kind of pros and cons that I hear people talk about when it comes to this general method of activism. And the ideas are that you do need this piece to increase awareness, that we use conscious raising in a lot of different spaces. Safe training that I do as the GSC coordinator, it has historically included a lot of consciousness raising in it. I've shifted it to be a little bit more practical, but this is very often what these trainings are, especially when we talk about trainings that are intended to make people have fewer negative feelings towards an oppressed community. It's just really not my vibe to train that way, but that's what we often see. You see therapy groups and support groups. So I've been in support groups, have been in as facilitator and participant support groups for trans people, where a lot of what we're doing is sharing our experiences with cis sexism and transphobia, and helping people get through them. But for me, I think that was also huge in just understanding the ways in which transphobia was impacting my experience, the ways it impacted my experience growing up, including like why I didn't understand being trans until I was in college. And that being a result of cis sexism. And I think a really important example is domestic violence prevention groups. So these are groups that are for people who have committed intimate partner violence or domestic violence infractions, or have shown behaviors that would indicate they are at high risk of assaulting someone in particular. And so they're sent to the therapy group they're required to attend. And I've been able to sit in on these before. And a lot of what they are doing is consciousness raising around healthy masculinities and around sexism, and why they feel entitled to women and power in the ways that they do, and really deconstructing that so that they can have healthier relationships with themselves and with other people. And so in that way, I'm like, this is so essential. And I think being in that group and kind of seeing that work being done in particular, I can't discount that. We need this just for our understandings of ourselves, as I've mentioned. The idea here is, if we don't understand how these systems affect us, other people, how do we know what changes to even advocate for, or how to go about those changes? And as folks have mentioned, the personal is political. The argument against this is generally just that it's not a sufficient endpoint. That it's important for people to understand that the work, whether on yourself or towards dismantling systems for others, does not end with consciousness raising. And nearly every social movement sees this issue of how much do we talk and build before we can start making the changes that we say we want to make. How do we come to agreements about what those changes are? How universal does that need to be? How much do we pay attention to marginalized communities within those communities first? Do we do what's best for the majority of this marginalized group? What do we mean by this marginalized group? So, a big argument we've seen historically in LGBTQ plus communities is, do we push forward this amendment that bans discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, so being queer or being trans, when the majority of the opposition is with the trans part? Or do we try to push forward this bill that just bans discrimination on sexual orientation and come back for trans people later? But then do you come back for us later? And is it even possible to add that part? If you just acknowledge that most of the opposition is towards that piece, how is it ever going to pass? And so activist circles are making these, and social movements are making these sorts of decisions all the time. We see similar kind of infighting around Black Lives Matter. We've seen, I've seen through folks in my life kind of infighting between indigenous communities or between aspects of the queer community. Once we've been able to actually establish goals, and I think, what argument is that conscious raising is, maybe step one, and meeting together to bring forth these goals is maybe a step two. How do we actually get the things that we're asking for, and are we prepared to do that? And so that preparation can't only be consciousness raising. Sometimes that's very logistical preparations of, do we have a place to meet? Do we know where we could do a rally? Is it logistically possible to change this thing that we're trying to change, or is there something else we could change that is more doable? Should we do that? All of these pieces together. So fourth wave feminism, internet said it began in 2012, which is mathematically impossible in that I learned about it in 2011 or 2012, and it was already in our textbooks. So it began in the late 2000s and really rose to prominence in the early 2010s. And it is often seen as a recognition of the strengths and weaknesses of the other waves that we've had of feminism. It strongly focuses on intersectionality and dismantling systems of oppression, like the radicals. And it also focuses on empowering women and trans and non-binary people, with that empowerment piece being so much like the reformists. And I think where I think I can defend that it is a wave we've learned from previous waves is that I think most fourth wave folks would argue that we should be attacking these systems and these issues in all of these ways, that organizations can help to delegate tasks to people who are good at certain things, that they can help us to be paid for this labor, when one of the things that we're trying to do is be accommodated for the labor that people are doing, and to make things as fair as possible for everyone in terms of what their access to finances looks like, and they're doing labor, and thinking about like the value of people versus as not just the value of their labor comes into play here too. Fourth wave folks totally utilize consciousness raising, though I think a lot of this is really done online. So when I do SAFE trainings, which are our LGBTQ plus 101 trainings here at Oakland, one of the things that I say to folks is, think about who you're following on social media. Try to follow more LGBTQ plus people, but think about each of those letters. Think about Black queer people, Black trans people, Black non-binary people, about intersex people with lots of different identities, thinking about disabled queer people and queer immigrants and all of these different things, right? And so I think a lot of the ways that we've adapted consciousness raising into the 2010s and the 2020s is the utilization of technology. For me, I think in really casual ways, the way that I came to understand my own transness was through little daily bursts of consciousness raising, having a place like the GSC where folks would just be in there having regular conversations about their daily lives as queer people and trans people, and that being an exercise in consciousness raising, that it didn't have to be in a group, but that the piece around valuing people's lived experiences and having that be a form of gaining knowledge was very much true for me. Fourth wave feminists are also really likely to talk about direct action and mutual aid. So this is the ideas the radicals talked about of how do we just skip to the helping people part. How do we help people right now? The radicals are very concerned about like, no, we need to fix this for people right now. And fourth wave folks are as well. Direct action being people, especially people who carry some level of privilege, going and having communities who are in need express what their needs are, having people who have the ability to help with those needs to go in and directly do that work. And then also the community building aspect, the bringing people together, those casual acts of consciousness raising. And I really think online spaces have provided people with so many opportunities to build communities. And then we can also think of communities in broader ways. My side gig is that I work in the gymnastics media space. And there are a lot of specific communities in gymnastics where people maybe have never met each other, or they've only met each other a few times. And one of those is like the sisterhood of survivors of Larry Nassar. And they describe themselves as a community and as a force to be reckoned with, and they are. And most of them have never met each other. That queer gymnasts and college gymnasts have really, and especially college gymnasts of color, have really come out in full force for each other, often in ways that cross rivalries between teams or past history that they might have with that person. Some things I want to mention is, in case it wasn't clear throughout the timeline, there was never a point in which everybody agreed on what we needed to do here. And that is still very much true today. You can certainly see some generational differences. The folks in my life who are in their 40s, 50s, and up, if they talk about feminism, it's definitely going to sound more like the reformists. Though some of the people I know in their 50s and 60s, it's really going to sound like the radicals. I think what's really beautiful about the way that feminism approaches this issue within our own movement is to see it as part of the thing that we are studying. That people aren't necessarily right or wrong, they're informed by their own specific context. People don't just suddenly forget all the context and trauma that led them to their beliefs in the first place. And that we're not always looking to change people's minds, that we're not necessarily asking everyone to move into the next wave. There are certainly ways in which we, I think, can expect people to evolve and change when they are provided with information. But their kind of roots and why they care what they care about is likely not going to change a ton. And so it's important for us to understand these shifts in the movement and to be able to, so that we can work with folks across age divides and culture divides towards the goals that we do share. Most people weren't and aren't 100% one wave or one type of feminist. It's not everyone who is in their 20s and 30s right now is a fourth wave person, and everyone who is in their 40s and 50s is a third wave. And it's not like that. There's lots of overlap. I know students currently who I'm just like, wow, that is profoundly second wave ideology that you have. People connect with different things for different reasons. And what's great about this subject is that part of what we're doing is exploring those. What is it about this particular student, the other identities they hold, the experiences they have that makes them connect to this specific way of thinking about the world? That stuff is just really interesting to us as feminist scholars. And I think it's important to break the fourth wall a bit and say that, so much of this course is about consciousness raising that, when I talked to Women Gender Studies department chair, Dr. Amy Harbin, about me teaching this class, we talked about this class making sense for me to teach in that I already know how to do consciousness raising, basically. That is my job in a lot of ways, that is a thing that I'm passionate about doing. And that's a feminist way of looking at who should be here in teaching this class. Okay, so that is it for the consciousness raising content. I did want to show you this resource here, which is a link to a YouTube playlist that I have made for this course. If somebody knows of a good way for me to think of a good way or wants to help me out with organizing these so that it is clear which weeks they kind of go with, that would be super helpful. But I do think it's kind of, you can kind of tell as you go through, especially as you get through further. But these are videos that are totally optional for you to watch. This is not about, assignments or requirements, but this is, a virtual consciousness raising exercise that, YouTube is a great resource that I utilize a lot in all of my jobs, basically. And, for me, short form, medium form, even sometimes long digital video, just really accessible way for me to learn. And so I've curated this list here. So this is kind of the stuff that relates to week 1, stuff about from week 2. So we talked about misogynoir last week, so that's here. This is some of the stuff that I think is going to be relevant to today. And the start of these trans-related things are going to be the start of our conversation for next week. So I'm going to keep adding to this as I find stuff. And we may end up using some of these in class, or I may directing you to specific ones and recommending that you take a look at those. But they're not required. They're not part of your assignments. I just think that, some folks, if you find something interesting, want to learn more, I wanted to give you a way to get started. Also, as I was looking for videos to actually use in the course, ended up finding a lot of stuff that I didn't necessarily want to use or that I couldn't use, but that I thought was really valuable for you to have access to.